For most of our life, we've believed propaganda was something that happened somewhere else, in distant lands. Under heavy boots, behind iron curtains, it was the tool of dictators, the weapon of tyrants, the voice of regimes we were taught to oppose. We were different. We had newspapers. We had debate. We had elections. We had freedom, and yet propaganda has never required chains or uniforms. It has never needed to shout. In fact, the most powerful propaganda rarely raises its voice at all. It slips quietly into the background, into headlines, into radio broadcasts, into television screens glowing softly in the living room after dinner. It wraps itself in patriotism, in safety, in common sense. It feels familiar. During the Second World War, posters urged Americans to conserve, to enlist, to believe. Families gathered around radios, listening to confident voices describe distant battles. The message was clear, simple, reassuring. We were united. We were right. We would prevail, and often we did. But propaganda is not always a lie. That is what makes it difficult to see. Sometimes it is truth, carefully selected. Sometimes it is emotion, carefully guided. Sometimes it is repetition, so steady and constant that it begins to feel like reality itself. Psychologists have long understood something simple about human nature. The more often we hear a statement, the more likely we are to accept it as true. Not because we are foolish, not because we are weak, but because familiarity feels safe, and safety is powerful. Over the decades, Americans have faced wars, assassinations, economic crises, cultural upheavals. Through it all, information flowed steadily, through newspapers, through television, through trusted anchors who sat in our homes each evening. We believed we were informed, but information and persuasion are not always separate things. The line between them can be thin, almost invisible. Propaganda does not require deception in every sentence. It works best when it blends seamlessly into ordinary life, when it sounds reasonable, responsible, even patriotic. It works best when intelligent. Thoughtful people never suspect it is there. And here is the quiet truth. No nation, however free, is immune from influence. No generation is beyond persuasion. No citizen is too experienced to be shaped by repetition, emotion, and carefully framed narratives. If propaganda works best when we don't notice it, how often has it shaped the very opinions we call our own? That question is not meant to accuse. It is meant to invite reflection. Because understanding propaganda is not about blaming the past. It is about recognizing the water we have been swimming in all along. When the United States entered the First World War in 1917, it faced a problem. Most Americans did not want to fight. The war in Europe felt distant, complicated, foreign. Many citizens believed it was not our battle to join. President Woodrow Wilson himself had campaigned on keeping America out of war, and yet, within a matter of months, public opinion shifted dramatically. Young men lined up at enlistment offices. Families bought war bonds. Communities rallied around a shared purpose. Dissent became rare and often unwelcome. That transformation did not happen by accident. It was organized. Shortly after declaring war, the federal government created the Committee on Public Information, the CPI. It was a new kind of agency. Its mission was not to fight on the battlefield, But to shape opinion at home, the committee recruited journalists, artists, filmmakers, advertisers, the most creative communicators of the day. They understood something powerful. Information alone does not move people. Emotion does. Posters began appearing everywhere. Uncle Sam pointing directly at the viewer. I want you. A stern warning to conserve food, to buy bonds, to protect the nation. These images were simple, bold, impossible to ignore. They were designed to stir pride, to awaken duty, and at times to provoke fear. German soldiers were often portrayed as savage and barbaric. Stories, some true, some exaggerated, spread rapidly about atrocities overseas. The enemy was not simply another army. It was a threat to civilization itself. This was not random exaggeration. It was strategic. The CPI also organized what were called 4-minute men. These were volunteers who delivered short patriotic speeches during intermissions at movie theaters and public gatherings. For 4 minutes at a time across thousands of towns. Americans heard the same message. This war mattered, and your participation mattered. Repetition became a powerful ally, and it worked. By the time the war ended, the machinery of persuasion had proven itself remarkably effective. But the story did not end there. 2 decades later, the world once again moved toward war. This time, it was even more devastating. When the United States entered World War II after the attack on Pearl Harbor, public anger was immediate and genuine. The shock of that December morning created unity almost overnight. Yet even in a moment of authentic outrage, the government understood that sustaining morale over years of sacrifice required careful messaging. Hollywood stepped forward. Studios collaborated with federal agencies to produce films that supported the war effort. Movies depicted brave American soldiers, noble sacrifices, clear moral lines between good and evil. Radio programs reinforced the same themes. Newsreels shown before feature films delivered carefully framed updates from the front lines. The message was consistent. We are united. We are righteous, and victory is inevitable. Even language was chosen with care. Casualties were often described in ways that softened the emotional blow. Strategic setbacks were framed as temporary obstacles. Successes were highlighted, repeated, and celebrated. At home, Americans were encouraged to ration gasoline, conserve rubber, grow victory gardens, and purchase war bonds. These efforts created a sense of shared responsibility. Participation was not optional, it was patriotic, and most Americans embraced it wholeheartedly. It is important to understand something here. Not all of this messaging was false. Much of it reflected genuine danger and legitimate national defense. The Axis powers posed real threats. The sacrifices were real. The courage was real. Propaganda does not require complete fabrication. It often relies on emphasis, on selecting certain truths and placing them front and center, while other complexities remain in the background. For example, during World War II, the internment of Japanese Americans was presented to the public as a necessary security measure. Fear was high. Trust was fragile. Many citizens accepted the policy without fully questioning its fairness. Emotion, once stirred, can narrow the space for debate. And that is one of propaganda's most enduring techniques. Simplify the story. In times of crisis, Complexity feels uncomfortable. Nuance can seem dangerous. A clear narrative, good versus evil, loyalty versus betrayal, offers psychological relief. It gives people certainty. Certainty is comforting. During both world wars, dissent was not entirely silenced, but it was discouraged. The Espionage Act and Sedition Act of World War I made certain forms of criticism punishable. Newspapers were cautious. Citizens were careful about what they said in public. Social pressure became its own enforcement tool. No one wanted to be seen as disloyal. The techniques developed during these years laid a foundation that would influence decades to come. Emotional appeal. Repetition. Simplification. Demonization of the enemy. Appeals to patriotism. Selective presentation of facts. These methods did not vanish when peace treaties were signed. They became part of a broader understanding of how public opinion could be shaped, not only in war, but in other arenas as well. There is something else worth reflecting on. The Americans who responded to these messages were not naive. They were not foolish. They were farmers, factory workers, teachers, parents. They were thoughtful citizens responding to the information available to them. Propaganda does not target ignorance. It targets emotion. It speaks to fear, to pride, to belonging, to the deep human desire to be on the right side of history. And in moments of national emergency, those desires intensify. The war posters eventually faded. The radio broadcasts shifted tone. The celebrations began. But the machinery, the understanding that opinion could be mobilized with careful messaging, remained. Governments had learned that shaping belief at home could be just as vital as winning battles abroad. Question that lingers is not whether the wars were justified. Historians continue to debate the details. The sacrifices were undeniable. The question is something quieter. If these techniques proved so effective during times of obvious crisis, what happens when they are applied during times of peace? When the threat is less visible, when the urgency is not declared from a podium, but implied through tone and repetition, the posters may have come down, but persuasion had discovered its power, and power, once revealed, is rarely forgotten. When the guns of World War II fell silent, Americans exhaled. The nation had endured years of sacrifice. Ration books were tucked away. Soldiers came home. Factories shifted back to civilian production. There was hope, steady, confident hope, that peace would bring stability. But peace did not bring calm. It brought a new kind of fear. The Soviet Union, once an uneasy ally, was now a rival. Nuclear weapons had changed the stakes of global conflict. The idea of communism, an ideology many Americans barely understood, began to feel like a shadow stretching across the world. This time, the enemy was not across an ocean. The enemy, Americans were told, could be anywhere. In the late 1940s and early 1950s, the term Red Scare entered the national vocabulary. The color red, once simply a color, became shorthand for subversion. Infiltration, betrayal. And fear, once again, proved to be a powerful persuader. Politicians began speaking of communist agents embedded in government agencies. Newspapers reported on espionage cases. Radio commentators warned of hidden threats. The language was urgent, sometimes vague, often dramatic. Uncertainty filled the air. Into this atmosphere stepped Senator Joseph McCarthy of Wisconsin. In 1950, McCarthy claimed he possessed a list of communists working inside the State Department. The exact number shifted over time. The evidence was rarely clear, but the headlines were unmistakable. Communists in government, enemies within. The accusation alone carried enormous weight. McCarthy's power did not come from detailed proof. It came from repetition and amplification. Each speech, each hearing, each headline reinforced the idea that the threat was real and immediate. And once an idea is repeated often enough, it begins to feel undeniable. The House Un-American Activities Committee, known as HUAC, held public hearings investigating alleged communist influence in Hollywood, labor unions, and other institutions. Witnesses were called to testify. Some cooperated. Others refused. Those who declined to answer questions were often cited for contempt. Careers were destroyed. Reputations erased. The term blacklist became part of everyday conversation. Actors, screenwriters, directors, many found themselves unable to work, not because they had been convicted of crimes, but because suspicion alone was enough. Suspicion became contagious. Friends distanced themselves from one another. Colleagues hesitated to associate too closely. Employers acted cautiously. In some communities, neighbors watched neighbors. The technique was not new. Fear narrows the mind. When people feel threatened, they crave clarity. They look for certainty. And in times of uncertainty, simple narratives feel reassuring. There are patriots, and there are traitors. The gray areas, the complex realities of political belief and free speech begin to fade. Media played a crucial role during this era. Newspapers covered hearings extensively. Radio broadcasts replayed key accusations. Television, still a relatively new medium, brought the drama of congressional investigations directly into American living rooms. For the first time, citizens could watch confrontations unfold in real time. The emotional impact was immediate. When someone was accused on camera, the image lingered. Doubt spread quickly. Even if later evidence contradicted the accusation, the first impression often remained. Psychologists call this the primacy effect. The first narrative we hear can anchor our perception long after corrections appear. And during the Red Scare, first impressions were powerful. It is important to remember that the Cold War was not imaginary. The Soviet Union did engage in espionage. Nuclear tensions were real. The stakes felt existential. But propaganda does not require a completely fabricated threat. It amplifies. It simplifies. It suggests that danger is closer, broader, more immediate than evidence may support. In 1954, television itself played a surprising role in shifting public opinion. Journalist Edward R. Murrow aired a broadcast examining McCarthy's methods. Calmly, methodically, Murrow presented footage of the senator's own statements, allowing viewers to draw their own conclusions. For many Americans, it was the first time the machinery of accusation was examined with equal intensity. Soon after, McCarthy faced censure by the Senate, but the atmosphere he helped create did not vanish overnight. Deeper lesson lingered. Fear can mobilize a nation. It can silence dissent without formal censorship. it can persuade ordinary citizens to accept extraordinary measures. During the Red Scare, the accusation of being un-American carried enormous weight. That phrase alone could end careers, friendships, and futures. Notice how language itself became a tool. Un-American. The term suggests that identity and belief are inseparable. That disagreement is not simply a difference of opinion, but a betrayal of belonging. And belonging matters deeply. Humans are social creatures. We fear isolation. We fear exclusion. When public discourse frames dissent as disloyalty, many people retreat into silence. Silence can look like agreement. But often it is self-protection. The Red Scare demonstrated how propaganda can operate without posters or war bonds. It can unfold through hearings, headlines, and carefully chosen phrases. It can be fueled not only by government agencies, but by media outlets and public anxiety. It does not always require coordination. Sometimes fear spreads organically, amplified by those who find political advantage in sustaining it. The psychological mechanisms are subtle, but enduring. Amplify threat. Simplify the narrative. Repeat the warning. Frame dissent as danger. Over time, suspicion becomes normal. And once suspicion becomes normal, extraordinary measures feel justified. The Red Scare eventually subsided. The intensity faded. Blacklists slowly dissolved. Reputations were reconsidered. But the episode left behind an important reminder. Propaganda does not always arrive wrapped in flags or dramatic slogans. Sometimes it arrives as a question. Are you loyal? Do you have something to hide? In moments of national tension, those questions can echo loudly. The era also revealed something else. Fear can turn inward. During wartime, propaganda often directs emotion toward an external enemy. During the Red Scare, that enemy was imagined to be within our own institutions. Even within our own communities, that shift from outward threat to inward. Suspicion changes the social fabric. Trust erodes. Conversations grow cautious. The desire for safety begins to outweigh the comfort of open debate. And when trust weakens, people become more dependent on authoritative voices to tell them whom to fear. That dependency is fertile ground for persuasion. The Red Scare did not end American democracy, but it showed how quickly democratic norms can strain under pressure. It showed how fear can magnify accusations. And it showed how media, whether print, radio, or the young glow of television, can amplify emotion as effectively as information. If fear could reshape a nation's conversation once, if suspicion could silence artists, teachers, and public servants, what might happen when technology expands the reach of messaging even further? When images travel instantly. When narratives compete at lightning speed, the Cold War would continue for decades, but the lessons of the Red Scare had already revealed something enduring. The battle for public opinion does not require armies. It requires emotion. And fear, perhaps more than any other emotion, moves swiftly through the human heart. By the time the 1960s arrived, the world was changing faster than most Americans could fully grasp. Television, once a luxury, was now a fixture in nearly every living room. The soft hum of the set in the evenings became a quiet companion. Families gathered around the glow of the screen, not merely for entertainment, but to witness the world unfolding before them. And the world was on fire. The Vietnam War was unlike any conflict Americans had experienced. Unlike the two world wars, the battlefields were distant, jungled, and confusing. The enemy was often unseen. Ambushes, guerrilla attacks, and strange terrain made it difficult to define victory in simple terms. Yet for the first time, war was no longer confined to the front lines. It entered our homes. Night after night, Americans watched images of soldiers, helicopters, and villages on the evening news. Film footage brought death and destruction close to us, intimate and immediate. For many, it was their first experience of war as it actually happened, unfiltered by second-hand reports. And yet, the images alone did not tell the whole story. The government, while allowing the press access, carefully managed information. Reports emphasized strategic gains, not failures. Language was measured. Battles were described as successes or operations rather than tragedies. Casualties were framed as necessary sacrifices for the cause of freedom. The line between information and persuasion began to blur. Television anchors, often calm and deliberate in tone, became trusted intermediaries. Their words carried authority. When they described events with confidence, viewers felt they were being told the truth. Yet the framing of facts, what was shown, what was left out, was itself a form of influence. Meanwhile, the war effort relied on more than words. Propaganda was subtle. It was in the selection of images. It was in the music behind a scene, in the pauses between reports, in the way soldiers' bravery was emphasized while civilian suffering was minimized. Emotion, once again, became a tool. But here a new challenge emerged. Television allowed Americans to see the war in ways never before possible. The horrors were no longer abstract. They were immediate. Families who watched felt outrage, grief, confusion. Trust in the government began to erode as what people saw on screens did not always match the optimistic briefings from officials. This was the birth of what came to be called the credibility gap. People began asking, if the news shows devastation, but the government calls it progress, which is true? Some turned to skepticism, some to anger, some to outright protest. For the first time, propaganda, as carefully crafted messaging, encountered the challenge of modern media. The very medium that could inform could also expose the contradictions, and the public responded in ways that were unpredictable. Yet the government did not abandon its methods. It adapted. Messages were refined. Reports were designed to emphasize victories, to highlight heroism, to inspire patriotism, to reassure a worried public. Official statements were repeated, broadcast after broadcast. Repetition, as ever, remained a powerful tool. At the same time, cultural shifts added another layer. Music, literature, and television dramas began to challenge official narratives. Anti-war songs reached millions. Novelists and filmmakers questioned the morality of the conflict. These cultural counterweights offered an alternative perspective, yet they too influenced public sentiment, shaping perception with emotion as much as fact. Through it all, the psychological impact on viewers was profound. Families watched the war nightly. Parents saw young men in uniform, some of them their own children's age, falling in distant jungles. Communities debated the meaning of sacrifice, of duty, of conscience. The sense of national unity that had defined previous wars began to fracture. The Vietnam era demonstrated a crucial lesson about modern propaganda. Access to information does not guarantee clarity. Exposure to images and reports does not automatically create understanding. The way information is presented, the framing, the selection, the tone shapes perception just as much as the facts themselves. And in this era, emotion could override logic. Fear, grief, anger, and hope all became channels through which influence traveled. People responded not only to what they were told, but to how they felt while hearing it. The war also introduced a new kind of tension, the conflict between what was seen and what was said. Journalists captured brutality and chaos. Officials delivered reassurances and strategic updates. Citizens struggled to reconcile the two. The trust that once seemed natural in authority, in institutions, in the news became conditional. By the late 1960s, protest movements had grown across the nation. College campuses, city streets, and even churches became arenas of debate. Propaganda, whether from government sources or activist groups, was everywhere, vying to shape perception, emotion, and loyalty. The Vietnam era, perhaps more than any earlier conflict, exposed the delicate dance between media, message, and mind. The machinery of influence was no longer one way. Citizens could see, question, and respond. And yet, even as skepticism grew, the techniques of persuasion, repetition, framing, emotional appeal continued to operate in subtle ways, shaping thoughts without overt coercion. By the end of the decade, the United States would withdraw from Vietnam. The nation would be left with wounds, questions, and the awareness that seeing the truth was not always simple. For the first time, Americans confronted a profound realization. Information can be both a guide and a tool of influence. The medium itself, television, could reveal reality, but also shape how reality was understood. And as the credibility gap widened, the question lingered quietly in living rooms across the country. When what we see conflicts with what we are told, how do we know what to believe? The Vietnam era left an enduring legacy, not only in history books, but in the consciousness of the nation. It revealed that propaganda could be as subtle as a carefully framed image, that emotion could carry as much weight as fact, and that in a world of rapidly expanding media, the battle for hearts and minds had become more complex than ever before. And yet, the machinery of persuasion did not stop with war. It quietly evolved, learning, adapting, and preparing for a new stage in the story. What came next would transform the way Americans were influenced, not on the battlefield, but in everyday life. By the 1950s, the United States was changing once again. The guns of war had fallen silent, and a different kind of effort was underway, an effort to rebuild, to grow, to enjoy the comforts of peace. Americans moved to the suburbs. Families bought homes with white picket fences. Cars rolled off assembly lines in endless colors. Television sets flickered in living rooms from coast to coast. And with these changes came a new kind of messaging, quieter than wartime posters, but just as powerful. Advertising had become a science, not just an art. Psychologists, sociologists, and marketers studied human behavior with an almost obsessive attention to detail. They learned what moved people, what inspired desire, what created loyalty. It was no longer enough to tell someone a product existed. It was about what the product said about them, what it said about who they were or who they could be. A washing machine was not just a washing machine. It was freedom. It was modernity, a symbol that a family could rise above struggle and embrace comfort. A soda was not just a drink. It was youth, vitality, belonging. Marketers understood something profound. Emotion is far more persuasive than logic. Aspirations, fears, dreams, they could be harnessed, shaped, repeated, and ultimately owned. Television became the perfect vehicle. Between popular shows, commercials delivered messages crafted with precision. Children watched colorful ads promising candy or toys. Mothers saw products framed as essential for family well-being. Fathers glimpsed gadgets that symbolized success. Even politics would take notice. By the 1960s, political campaigns began borrowing techniques from Madison Avenue. Candidates became brands. Slogans were short, memorable, repeatable. Images were carefully selected, framed, and broadcast to evoke pride, trust, and identification. And just as in wartime propaganda, repetition became key. Hearing a message once might not be enough, but hour after hour, day after day, week after week, messages seeped in. They became familiar, and familiarity, as psychologists have long known, often feels like truth. The lines between information and persuasion grew thinner. Advertising and propaganda began to overlap, not in method alone, but in subtle intent. Both sought to influence thought and behavior. Both relied on emotion, identity, and selective presentation. Both shaped perceptions of what was desirable, right, or necessary. Consider the cultural shifts of the era. Television shows presented idealized families, neighborhoods, and lifestyles. They offered not just entertainment, but a vision of how life should look. If viewers wanted to belong, to fit into this ideal, they needed to adopt certain habits, consume certain products, embrace certain values. And so, the medium itself became a guide, not just for shopping, but for living. The unspoken message was everywhere. To be good, to be successful, to be happy, is to align with this vision. Consumerism became entwined with identity. Owning the right products suggested virtue. Choosing the wrong ones could suggest failure or inadequacy. Choices, once simple, were loaded with social meaning. Marketers learned another enduring truth. Subtlety often works better than force. People resist messages that feel like commands, but they embrace suggestions that feel aspirational. The most effective advertising does not tell you what to think. It shows you what you could be. Emotion, association, and desire became its tools. And as always, repetition reinforced the message. The same jingles, the same images, the same slogans appeared across multiple channels, leaving an imprint on memory that often felt unconscious. This was not propaganda in the overtly political sense, but its techniques were remarkably similar. It shaped behavior, perceptions, and ultimately, the very culture itself. And when politics adopted these methods, the potential for influence expanded dramatically. Candidates could project an image of confidence and relatability, bypassing detailed debate or policy discussion. Television reduced complex issues into visuals, sound bites, and emotional cues. Citizens were being persuaded as much by tone, imagery, and repetition as by the facts themselves. By the 1970s and 1980s, these methods had matured. Advertising was everywhere. Billboards, magazines, radio, and television were saturated with messages designed to capture attention, evoke feeling, and cultivate loyalty. The subtle power of repetition, association, and emotional appeal had become an invisible architecture in American life. It was a reminder that persuasion does not always roar. Sometimes it whispers, and whispers, repeated endlessly, can shape habits, beliefs, and even identities. As Americans were swept up in this culture of consumption, the question emerged quietly, almost imperceptibly. When the methods of marketing designed to sell products are applied to politics or social issues, how do we recognize when we are being influenced? Advertising had taught a new lesson. The human mind is malleable, not through force, but through familiarity and desire. And when desire is coupled with repeated imagery and emotional resonance, resistance becomes difficult. The line between choice and influence can become nearly invisible. And the people who master these techniques are often the ones who shape the culture, subtly, persistently, and powerfully. Consumerism, advertising, and the new media landscape of the post-war era demonstrated that persuasion was not limited to war or fear. It had entered everyday life, quiet and insistent, guiding choices, shaping aspiration, and preparing the stage for future forms of influence that would be even more pervasive. By understanding the mechanisms at work in advertising, one begins to see the continuity of persuasion across time. The techniques of emotion, repetition, framing, and identity that had mobilized soldiers and citizens in wartime were now reshaping hearts and minds in peacetime. And while the products were different, washing machines instead of war bonds, the message remained consistent. Humans are influenced not just by facts, but by feeling, and those who understand feeling hold a subtle, persistent power. The machinery of influence had not slowed. It had simply changed form, moving from the posters of the 1940s to the screens, jingles, and images of post-war America. And as the nation moved toward the 24-hour news cycle, toward round-the-clock coverage, toward a media landscape that could deliver messages instantly and endlessly, the lessons of advertising would become the blueprint for a new era of persuasion. The question lingered quietly, almost invisibly, when influence becomes as familiar as the air we breathe. How do we know which desires are truly our own? By the 1980s, the way Americans received information had begun to change again. Television no longer stopped at the evening news. Cable networks brought constant coverage. Channels multiplied. Voices multiplied. Headlines scrolled across the screen, hour after hour. The news was no longer something that happened once a day. It was always happening. And with this constant flow came a new kind of pressure. Not only to watch, but to react. Not only to know, but to feel. The 24-hour news cycle created a sense of urgency that never truly existed before. Every development was framed as immediate, every event as breaking. In this world, the line between calm observation and emotional reaction grew thin. The techniques were subtle, yet powerful. Repetition, once a tool for wartime posters and jingles, now became a tool for headlines. Stories were repeated across programs, across networks, until viewers began to accept them as the central truth of the day. Framing became more important than ever. What was shown on camera and what was left out shaped perception. A single image could define a narrative. A well-chosen phrase could sway opinion more effectively than a detailed report. Consider the tone of coverage. Anchors and commentators, often calm and authoritative, guided viewers through a non-stop stream of information. But even authority carries influence. The subtle inflection in a voice, the order in which events are presented, the emphasis placed on one statistic over another, all these things shape understanding. And then there was emotion. News that provoked fear, anger, or anxiety demanded attention. People could not look away. Emotional intensity became its own currency. The more intense the coverage, the more likely viewers were to stay engaged. And in staying engaged, they were absorbing influence, often unconsciously. Segmentation also became part of the landscape. Different networks, different shows began to cater to different audiences. Viewers could choose a channel that confirmed what they already believed. And once confirmed, those beliefs became stronger. Confirmation bias. The human tendency to accept information that aligns with pre-existing views became amplified. And in an environment where messages are constant, repeated, and tailored, this bias is difficult to resist. The 24-hour news cycle also changed the pace of understanding. In the past, people had time to reflect between broadcasts or newspaper editions. Now, information came faster than reflection. Analysis often lagged behind reporting. The result was a culture of immediacy where emotion frequently outpaced reason, and the pressure to report quickly created its own challenges. Accuracy could be sacrificed for speed. Sensational stories rose to the top. Controversy drew attention. The news was no longer just a record of events. It became a performance, a competition for attention and engagement. Thus was not necessarily a matter of deliberate deception. Often the messages were true in isolation, but the way they were presented shaped interpretation. Selective emphasis, framing, and repetition influenced how viewers understood the significance of events. Psychologists studying media influence note something important. The human mind relies on patterns. When stories are repeated constantly, especially in emotionally charged ways, people internalize those patterns as reality. Over time, perception begins to align with the narrative being presented, not because facts have changed, but because interpretation has and this cycle fed on itself. Breaking news demanded immediate updates, which demanded more coverage, which demanded more emotion. Viewers, already engaged, became participants in the cycle. Their reactions, letters, calls, and later online comments were incorporated into future reporting. Influence was no longer only top-down, it was interactive, recursive. By the 1990s and early 2000s, these patterns were firmly established. The Gulf War, the Monica Lewinsky scandal, 9/11s, each event was broadcast continuously. Images, sound bites, and commentary shaped public understanding in real time. Americans were witnessing history as it happened, but also forming opinions based on the way the story was told. The tools were familiar: repetition, framing, emotional appeal. The scale was new. The constant stream amplified their effect. What might once have required weeks or months to influence opinion now unfolded in hours or even minutes, and the subtle effect on perception was profound. People began to experience the world as mediated by screens. Their understanding of events, their sense of urgency, their judgments about safety, morality, and responsibility were shaped as much by coverage as by reality. In this environment, skepticism became both essential and difficult. There was simply too much information to process carefully, and with so many channels, so many voices, so many interpretations, the human mind had to rely on shortcuts, mental heuristics that are useful but vulnerable to manipulation. The 24-hour news cycle demonstrated a crucial principle. Influence is not always about lying or forcing opinion. Sometimes it is about shaping perception, emphasizing certain details while minimizing others, and presenting information in a way that encourages emotional engagement. And when repetition, emotion, and immediacy combine, they can be extraordinarily persuasive. The implications extended far beyond news. Marketing, politics, social issues, all would adapt to this new reality. Messages could be amplified, repeated, and targeted with unprecedented precision. Citizens were now both audience and participant, influenced by what they saw and what they reacted to. The cycle, once begun, proved difficult to escape, and it quietly reshaped the national conversation, the way Americans understood current events, and the very rhythm of public attention. By the early 2000s, the 24-hour news cycle had matured. The machinery of influence was operating at full capacity, and as new technology emerged, social media, online forums, instant sharing, the patterns established by constant news coverage would evolve yet again, reaching directly into the lives, emotions, and opinions of each individual. The question, unspoken but persistent, lingered in homes across the nation. When information never stops, when stories are repeated endlessly, when emotion is constant, how can one truly know what to believe? The answer would not come immediately, but the stage had been set for the next era, an era in which influence would become more personalized, more subtle, and in many ways more powerful than ever before. By the time the 2010s arrived, the landscape of information had changed once again. The screens in our homes, offices, and pockets were no longer simply windows to the world. They were mirrors reflecting not only events, but our own choices, our own preferences, our own fears and desires. This was the age of algorithms, invisible, almost imperceptible, yet shaping the very information we consumed. Unlike newspapers, radio, or even the 24-hour news cycle, algorithms did not broadcast the same message to everyone. They tailored information to the individual. They learned from clicks, likes, and searches. They measured attention. They calculated engagement. And they delivered content designed to keep us watching, reading, or scrolling. At first, it seemed convenient. Platforms promised personalization, the news you wanted, the topics you cared about, stories filtered to match your interests. But behind this convenience lay something far more profound. The content we received was no longer neutral. It was selected, curated, prioritized, and often it was designed to provoke emotion. Anger, fear, outrage, even joy. These feelings became signals. Content that stirred them would be shown to more people faster and more often. Repetition, once the domain of posters, radio, and television, now occurred at an unprecedented scale. The subtle power of persuasion, honed over decades, was now amplified by technology. Messages could reach millions almost instantly. They could be tailored to resonate with the values, identities, and insecurities of each individual viewer. And unlike previous eras, influence was not only top-down, it was interactive. Users could share, comment, and amplify messages themselves, often unknowingly participating in the spread of persuasion. The audience became the conveyor, reinforcing narratives through engagement. The psychological effects were profound. Algorithms reinforced pre-existing beliefs. They created echo chambers, where users were repeatedly exposed to content that confirmed their worldview. Doubts were minimized. Contradictions were filtered out. Familiarity became certainty, and certainty felt like truth. It was not always malicious. Much of the content was created by ordinary users, by media outlets, or by advertisers simply seeking attention. Yet the effect could be strikingly similar to traditional propaganda, shaping perception, guiding emotion, influencing behavior. The algorithms also exploited identity. Political affiliation, cultural preference, even personal anxieties could determine what someone saw. Messages were no longer one-size-fits-all. They were individually tailored. The medium had become deeply intimate, and as with all forms of persuasion, emotion remained central. Messages that provoked fear, pride, or outrage commanded attention. Repetition reinforced the narrative. Over time, perception and reality began to align, not necessarily because facts had changed, but because the algorithm had shaped the lens through which facts were interpreted. This environment introduced new vulnerabilities. Foreign actors, political campaigns, and interest groups discovered that they could craft messages specifically for the algorithm. They could test headlines, images, and wording to maximize engagement. Influence could be engineered, measured, and optimized. The consequences were not abstract. Elections, social movements, and public debates were affected. Citizens often found themselves drawn into narratives carefully curated for them, designed to reinforce feelings rather than illuminate facts. At the same time, individuals began to notice. Awareness grew that feeds were not neutral. Discussions about filter bubbles, echo chambers, and the unseen forces behind content became part of the public conversation. People started questioning not only what they saw, but why they saw it. Yet even awareness is complicated. The algorithms adapt. They learn from behavior. Even attempts to seek balance can be filtered, deprioritized, or ignored. Influence becomes subtle, invisible, and persistent. The algorithm age demonstrates a critical truth. Propaganda does not require loud declarations, dramatic posters, or even lies. It can operate quietly, invisibly, through patterns, personalization, and repetition. Its effectiveness lies in subtlety, in tailoring messages to individual emotion, identity, and attention. The scale of this influence is unprecedented. Billions of interactions, milliseconds of attention, billions of decisions, each feeding the algorithm, each reinforcing the cycle. The machinery is not centralized in the same way as a government agency or media network. It is decentralized, emergent, and adaptive. and the impact extends beyond politics or news. It shapes culture, belief, even personal habits. What we value, what we fear, what we aspire to all can be influenced through curated information, repeated exposure, and emotional resonance. Yet the algorithm age also offers a choice. Awareness allows individuals to reflect, to question, to recognize patterns of influence. Critical thinking becomes a quiet resistance, a way to reclaim agency. The lesson is subtle, but important. The most effective persuasion may no longer come from a single voice or institution. It comes from an invisible network, personalized for each of us, shaping what we see, how we feel, and ultimately what we believe. And in recognizing this, we return to a question that has echoed through decades of influence. From wartime posters to television broadcasts, from advertising jingles to 24-hour news, if the most powerful messages are those we do not notice, how often have they shaped the very opinions we call our own? The algorithm age reminds us that influence is now woven into the fabric of daily life. That persuasion is no longer occasional or distant, but constant, adaptive, and deeply personal, and it quietly asks each of us, how do we decide for ourselves when the world around us has been designed to decide for us?